Spider-Man 3. Now, I think we can all agree that the first two Sam Raimi Spider-Man films are quite fantastic movies, with the third one being the outlier. However, after watching No Way Home, I've had this want and desire to go back and watch the third movie again and give it another shot. So, is it still worth a watch today? Stay tuned. Hey guys, my name is Brandon, aka the BrandoCritic, and I want to say thank you so much for being here and clicking on this video. I'm sending you a ton of positive vibes your way. Today I'm going to give you my honest, no BS review for Spider-Man 3 from 2007 and let you know if it's still worth a watch today. If you guys want to support the channel, then hit like and subscribe, and if you really want to support the channel, then go follow me on Patreon. And don't forget about my partners at Movie Scene Canada as well. Their link will be down below in the description. So, we have Spider-Man 3 directed by Sam Raimi, and you know him from such films as the Evil Dead trilogy, and Darkman, and The Gift, and Drag Me to Hell, and Oz the Great and Powerful, and of course the Spider-Man trilogy. And in Spider-Man 3 we have Peter Parker / Spider-Man, played by Tobey Maguire, who's finally at a good place in his life. He protects the city as Spider-Man, and the people love him for it. He's at the top of his class, and his lab partners with Gwen Stacy, played by Bryce Dallas Howard, and in love with Mary Jane Watson, played by Kirsten Dunst, who is now a Broadway star. However, Spidey's life is about to be turned upside down with number 1, while stargazing with Mary Jane, a meteorite lands in the park with a symbiote in it, which latches on to Peter's motorbike. This of course leads to the symbiote consuming Peter Parker while having a bad dream about number 2, Flint Marko, played by Haden Church, an escaped convict who is trying to steal money in order to pay for his daughter's medical situation. The thing that concerns Peter here is that he is really the man who killed Uncle Ben and is now the Sandman after falling into a particle accelerator. Number 3, Mary Jane and him are going through relationship problems again, as he seems to not be there for her in times of need. And maybe because he kissed another girl right in front of her face. Number 4, Harry Osborn, played by James Franco, now with his father's Green Goblin tech and performance-enhancing gas, wants to avenge his father and kill Peter. And number 5, Eddie Brock, played by Topher Grace, is a new photographer of the Daily Bugle out for Peter's job. All while the symbiote consumes Peter in hatred, revenge, and dance moves. So yes, from that synopsis you guys can tell that this movie is just loaded to the brim. And yes, you've heard it all before. There are too many villains in this movie, and we'll get into that later. But is Spider-Man 3 worth a watch today? In my own humble opinion, I'm gonna say yes, because I think that Spider-Man 3 is a good film. Nowhere near as good as Spider-Man 1 and 2, but that doesn't make it bad. This is a good movie with just way too many things in it, and we will get into that later. Now, I will admit to you guys that watching this movie today, in the current internet culture of those Bully Maguire memes and having all of those MCU movies out, and of course No Way Home, where, spoiler alert, Tobey Maguire does come back as Peter Parker / Spider-Man, this movie definitely has a different context, and I think it's almost welcome today. Now, when I saw this movie for the first time, I distinctly remember walking out of the theater, I was 12 years old, and saying, best Spider-Man movie. Best Spider-Man movie by far. When I was 12 years old, walking out of that theater, I loved it. Then of course when I was 15 years old and I was learning more about the collective consciousness of what people think about movies, and of course Spider-Man 3 being the bad one, I'm like, oh, a movie sucks, right? You want to try to fit in with the cool people. But then, you know, now being 26 years old and going back and watching it again, it's really not that bad. And especially in a world where the MCU has a sort of sameness to all their movies, like they're all consistently good, but you can tell that this movie had a vision. Sam Raimi's vision is all over these movies, but of course the third one, you can definitely see that studio interference start to creep in. But let's start with the good things about this movie, because there are quite a few of them. Number 1, the scale. I love how huge this movie is. Now, the fight sequences, you can tell in some certain shots that the CGI is definitely not as good as it is today, but for as many shots of Peter Parker falling down and you're like, oh, it's obviously CGI, there are also some amazing shots, like the Sandman transformation, when it goes from Sandman into Haden Church. That shot is still mind-blowing over 10 years later. And the action sequences, just like the first two, they are just so badass. Some shots in particular, I love when Harry gets clotheslined. And when Peter rescues Gwen Stacy. I just love that shot so much. It's just so badass. And the fights with Sandman are all really well done, like when they fight in the streets and they fight in the underground subway. This movie definitely delivers on the action, the spectacle, and the scope. And Sam Raimi brings that Spider-Man camp and comedy to this movie as well, especially with the French restaurant.
This is a French restaurant, no? We?
Bruce Campbell is in all of these movies, and I do think that this is his best performance. His whole French waiter bit, I'm just dying of laughter. And honestly, this movie has me dying of laughter a lot, but I will be honest. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that this movie is quite silly. So the reason why I'm laughing is probably one of the reasons why you're not laughing. Lines like,
"How'd that get in there?"
or when he's flirting with Miss Brandt, I just explode with laughter.
Your shots are so good.
I'd love to shoot you sometime.
Peter Parker. Peter.
When he just smashes Eddie Brock's camera and says,
"See you, chump."
When he's beating the out of Harry Osborn and he goes,
"Look at little Goblin Jr. Gonna cry?"
It's just so savage that I can't help but laugh. And of course you have the dance. It is awkward, sure, but I think it adds to this movie's charm. I really do think that. And for me personally, there's one scene where I start laughing at the screen and going, yeah, Tobey, is this right here. When the black suit theme comes on and he looks towards it in the closet, I'm just laughing so hard because it's just so badass. Come on. And speaking about the score, it really is fantastic in this movie. I mean, Danny Elfman did not come back, but the new themes are very welcome. I love that black suit theme. It's just so Spider-Man. And now let's talk about the villains. Here's the thing. Yes, there are too many villains in this movie. But the villains that are in this movie, I think, are extremely well done. Let's talk about the Sandman first. Thomas Haden Church as the Sandman is just fantastic. He is sympathetic. You understand where he's coming from. He has a wonderful, great design, and that power is just awesome. And he's not just some bad guy for Peter Parker to fight. Like, when he reaches for that locket, when he becomes Sandman, it brings me to tears every single time. It's a really great emotional scene. Now, back in film school, I learned about this, and I've talked about this before in other videos, but all great villains have one or two or three of these great attributes. Number one, they genuinely think they're the good guy. Flint Marko really does think that he's a good person, and this line sums it up perfectly.
I'm not a bad person. Just had bad luck.
Number two is that they have to be equal or more powerful than our hero. Better looking, smarter, more money, depending on what movie you're making, but they have to have more of an advantage over our hero. And of course, the Sandman is a very powerful villain. And number three, the villain has to have some sort of close relation to our hero. Of course, you have Darth Vader being Luke Skywalker's father. Flint Marko killed Uncle Ben. Now, some people complain that they retconned Spider-Man 1 and the death of Uncle Ben. Now, I understand that argument, but the guilt and responsibility that Peter got from that moment, it's still there, and Uncle Ben still did the right thing. So, in my mind, they didn't ruin that scene at all. So the Sandman is great, but let's talk about the black suit now. Let's be real, it looks just sick. I love that new look of the black suit Spider-Man, and it's quite a on-the-nose visual representation of the darkness that is taking over Peter Parker's heart. It's a little obvious, but it looks pretty cool. And I love how it's almost an allegory for alcoholism or drug addiction, where every single moment in this movie where Peter Parker is at his lowest, fighting with Mary Jane, fighting with Harry, finding out about Flint Marko, he turns to the suit. And of course it turns him into emo Peter Parker, or Bully Maguire as the internet folks like to call him. I understand that it's cheesy. I understand that the whole guy liner with the new hairstyle is a little weird, but again, remember, Peter Parker is supposed to be a dork. This is how a dork would act if he's trying to be cool, right? Peter Parker is not a cool character. He is a science nerd loser. But it really turns him into the villain of the movie, where the empathy that he learned in the first two Spider-Man movies is really gone. I mean, he kills Sandman. In his mind, he just murders him and doesn't feel any remorse for it.
Good riddance.
On top of that, he just beats the out of Harry. Now I gotta say that I love that action sequence. It's probably my favorite in the entire movie because there's no big CGI stunt work. It's just a full-on fist fight. And there's so much history between those two characters, and there's so much raw emotion in that scene. And it's just brutal and violent. It's really well done. And I love that final punch where just Harry gets knocked to the wall. Like, he is just out for the count. And then on top of that, Peter throws that pumpkin bomb at him and he walks away and you see his suit right in front of the frame. Oh man, just great filmmaking. But when Peter Parker's character gets to the lowest of the low is when he flat out uses Gwen Stacy to go to MJ's new job and get her jealous, and then he hits her. Peter Parker, in love with Mary Jane since he was 6 years old, hits her. Think about that for a moment. And that moment is heavy, especially when MJ says,
Who are you?
and he goes,
I don't know.
yeah. He's completely lost because ego and pride are the true villains of this movie. And it starts right from the beginning because he's talking to those kids and he's just like, hey, the whole world loves me.
They love me.
His ego is so bloated that his empathy is basically gone. He can't care for Mary Jane the way that she needs to be in a relationship because he only cares about the gratification that he gets from being Spider-Man, which of course is a giant turn from what happened in Spider-Man 2 when he didn't want to be Spider-Man anymore because he wanted to be with MJ. He wanted to have a life. He wanted to be better at school, all of that stuff. His ego has really taken over, so much so that he kisses another woman in front of Mary Jane and doesn't even think about how that would make her feel. And he plans to propose to MJ right after doing that. Doesn't even occur to him, gee, I just kissed another woman in front of my girlfriend who I'm gonna propose to. Doesn't even cross his mind. And he doesn't tell Harry about his amnesia. And I will admit, Harry did try to kill him, so it's a little bit of a gray area there, but still, he doesn't tell Harry to save his own ass. But we have Eddie Brock in here as well, and he's good too. I swear to God, he is a good villain, because he is just a dick. He is the complete antithesis of Peter Parker. He wants everything that Peter Parker wants. He wants that staff job, he wants the girl, and he really does not have any morals. He's willing to Photoshop a photo that Peter took just to screw him over and get that staff job. You can really tell that he did not have an Aunt May or an Uncle Ben in his life. And just to add insult to injury, the asshole goes to the church and asks God to kill Peter Parker.
You want forgiveness? Get religion. I want you to kill Peter Parker.
There's a reason why that symbiote went to him. He is like the worst version of Peter Parker. If Peter Parker kept that black suit, that's the worst possible scenario. Eddie Brock. Now sure, I wish that I saw him in the suit more, I wish I saw him as Venom more, but now here's where we get into the problems of the movie. There's too much in this movie. And you can really tell that with the pacing of the movie. In the first 10 minutes we get Peter's ego, the love life with Mary Jane, the introduction of Harry's Goblin, Peter Parker and MJ stargazing, the introduction of the symbiote, the introduction of Flint Marko, and the introduction of Flint Marko's daughter well within the first 10 minutes of the movie. Now, none of these scenes are bad scenes. There are no scenes in this opening 10 minutes that are awful scenes. They're all really well done, especially that Aunt May scene that I believe comes around the 15-minute mark. That's one of my favorite scenes of the movie, when she's talking about how Uncle Ben proposed to her and about how a man must put his wife before him. It's just an amazing scene, but you can tell that this movie is just gonna be overloaded with plot elements to juggle. It's a lot to handle, and looking at it from that perspective, you know, you really gotta give Sam Raimi some props for actually handling it to the best of his ability. Because like a lot of other people, and you've heard this all before when talking about Spider-Man 3, if some plot elements were dropped, then I feel like this movie could really explore the ones that it chooses to explore. More time exploring Peter and MJ's relationship and how they've grown since the end of Spider-Man 2, how she ran away from her wedding to be with Peter. More time to establish Harry Osborn's vengeance towards Peter. Because really, Harry Osborn got the real short end of the stick in this movie, and half the time he has amnesia, and really I think that's just a way to really put him in the back seat to allow room for Sandman and the symbiote and Venom, because really there's no build up to him being the Goblin. He's just the Goblin right away. And that fight sequence is like, what, 10-15 minutes into the movie, which is a great scene, but then of course you have the fist fight and then the battle at the end, and that's it. This villain that we've been building up for 3 films, that's all he gets, right? And half the film he's just unaware of his motivation and his backstory. I don't know, guys. I feel like Harry Osborn really got the short end of the stick in this movie. And to add insult to injury, the way that he forgives Peter Parker, the butler just tells him that it's his father's glider that killed him in the first movie. The butler. Remember, like Bernard, right? Is that his name? I don't know, guys. That was probably the biggest missed opportunity for this movie. But I want to end on the theme of forgiveness, because I think that this movie really tackles that human element very well, and it's all about forgiveness. And like Aunt May says, the hardest thing to do is to forgive ourselves.
You start by doing the hardest thing. You forgive yourself.
And what brings Peter Parker back is his good heart and his empathy. And the ending is great. Harry forgiving Peter, Peter forgiving himself, Peter forgiving Flint Marko, and MJ and Peter forgiving each other. The ending of this movie is them simply dancing in that little cafe where they work. No big epic sweeping shot of him swinging through New York City, just them dancing and just them forgiving each other. These movies are so human, and Spider-Man 3, yes, it is overloaded with things, and yes, some scenes are awkward, like the dancing, of course, and that one scene in the cafe with Gwen Stacy and MJ. It is a bit ridiculous, but I do think it has some charm. This movie is about people. the human elements are the real strong things in these movies. So for an overall rating, I'm gonna give this movie a 3 out of 5. I could have easily given this movie a 4 out of 5 if it just didn't have so many plot elements to juggle. And all those plot elements are done well. I just feel like if they are really explored, they could have been amazing, and it could have been a perfect final act to this trilogy. Maybe make it even a 2-parter. Keep some of these elements and put them into Spider-Man 4. I mean, again, all of these elements are really, really great. It's just too much of a good thing. So those are my thoughts on Spider-Man 3. What are yours? Leave them down in the comment section down below. I know that this film can get divisive. I know some people love it just because of the memes. I get it. Those are very, very funny. But whatever your thoughts, let them be known in the comment section down below. And if you guys are new here and you want to see more videos just like this, then definitely hit like and subscribe. I really do appreciate all the support. If you want to support me further, then follow me on Patreon, just like these wonderful people right here. And I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.